Hello, BISC130. This is the beginning of recorded lecture 4.4. Continuing on with these chapters on evolution. At the end of the previous lecture, we had defined evolution as change in the genetic makeup of a population over time, and we had defined theory as well. So the theory of evolution is supposed to explain why and how there are changes in the genetic makeup of populations over time. Because the theory of evolution is a theory, there is supposed to be a lot of supporting evidence for this. So instead of just defining the theory of evolution, let's look at what those observations and experiments are. So let me walk through these. I'm numbering them just so we could count through these, and the numbers aren't really relevant. But yeah, let's look at these observations. These are all observations that are highly reproducible. Biologists around the planet for many, many years have made these observations, and they're very consistent. They're very reproducible. So, okay, what do we got? All organisms reproduce exponentially. If you're not a math person, don't worry about it. Exponentially means graph look like this. In other words, all organisms are reproducing in such a way that over time, the population size is going to go up. They are making more of themselves. So all organisms reproduce in such a way that they create more of themselves. One example, I like these because you see them around campus, our eastern gray squirrel here. They have an average of, I don't have this memorized, I do have to consult my notes. They have an average of about 2 or 3 pups per year. Looks like a little bit more than the average here, but yeah, 2 or 3 pups per year. They could breed for over a dozen years. So yeah, that's having them making at least 24 offspring, a pair of them having at least 24 offspring in a lifetime. Yeah, 2 making 24, that's definitely increasing the total number. But this is still true even if we look at other organisms that reproduce much more slowly. African elephant is another interesting example here. They're not having offspring every single year. They're spending years taking care of a single calf, and yeah, single calf at a time, before they have another one. But even so, a pair of African elephants can have up to 8 calves in a lifetime. So yeah, they're a lot slower, but they are still a pair making 8. They are reproducing in such a way to make more of themselves over time. That's our first observation. Our second observation is that if we look at populations in nature, they tend to remain stable. They're reproducing in such a way that this graph is going to just grow wildly out of control very quickly. But if we observe populations of, squirrels or whatever it is, what we see is, there seems to be sort of a ceiling, a sort of leveling off point, that even though they're reproducing in such a way to make way, way, way more of themselves, they're pretty stable from year to year to year to year. Some are born, some die, but yeah, the population of squirrels on Tech Campus, for example, I'm not counting these squirrels, but I've been here about a decade or so. I would notice if they had doubled every other year. And people looking at these things much more closely find that population sizes tend to remain stable from year to year. So why is this? Well, I'm going to bring up the third observation, which might seem unrelated, but all 3 of these are going to tie together. Resources are limited. So again, this doesn't directly have to do with reproduction, but I mean, this is true. In anything you look at, the resources that these organisms need to survive, whether it's trees that are suitable for them to build their nests, or, acorns for them to eat, whether it's fresh water and things that these elephants graze on, these resources, or whether you're talking about the grass here, any organism. I'm just using, a couple of mammals here, but this is going to be true for all organisms, for fungi, for bacteria, for plants. Anything living anywhere is living in an environment where the resources that they need are not infinite. They're limited. There's a limited amount of food, whatever food is for you. There's a limited amount of space. There's a limited amount of sunlight. If you're photosynthetic, there's a limited amount of fresh water. These are just examples. Many other resources that are relevant. Anything living anywhere is going to be operating under limited resources. So let's pull these three observations together into an inference. In nature, there appears to be a struggle for survival to get those limited resources. Again, there's not enough food and shelter and sunlight to go around for everyone, so there's a struggle to get those limited resources. And only a portion of offspring will be able to survive and reproduce. In other words, not everyone's going to make it. They're all reproducing in such a way to make tons and tons more of themselves, but not every one of these squirrel pups is going to survive. Not every one of these elephant calves is going to survive. Any population of anything everywhere, not everyone is going to make it. There's just not enough to go around. Now, this phrase here, survive and reproduce, is a very important phrase that we will see come up many times in these lectures. Really, evolution is all about reproduction. Again, evolution, changing the genetic makeup of a population over time, occurs over time. It occurs over generations. To see this, we have to look at offspring being created and them growing up and then having offspring. So, the most important thing for evolution, for watching evolution, seeing the effects of this, is reproduction. But obviously survival is tied to that. You cannot reproduce if you are dead. So a lot of our examples and stuff are going to be about survival, but really it's about survival and reproduction. It's about whether you're passing your genetic information on to the next generation or not, but you need to survive to do that. So anyway, this is a common phrase we see in evolution. Not everyone can make it because of these limited resources. Only some will survive and reproduce. Okay, there are more observations. Next one, not everyone is the same. Variation exists within populations. Sometimes this variation is very easy to see. These coquina clams, some are very purple and some are more reddish. These are not a bunch of different species. These are all just different individuals within the same population, and there's a lot of variation there. Here's another sort of stark example. These are not ladybugs, they're Asian lady beetles, very related to ladybugs, but these look like a bunch of different species based on what they look like, their phenotype. But no, all these variations in shell color, the amount of red, the amount of black, these all exist within a single population. Variation exists. And these are obvious examples. There's still variation in less obvious examples. Going back to these squirrels, they kind of all look the same to me. I wonder if we all look the same to them. They all kind of look the same to me, but we know that, how meiosis and sexual reproduction works. If we were to, sequence the genomes of all four of these squirrels, we would see there would be differences between them. Even though phenotypically there aren't too many differences, there are going to be genotypic differences between these individuals. So variation exists within populations. Yeah, this is phenotypic and genotypic. Another way to say that is that there are different alleles in different individuals. Obviously, this clam has different alleles than this clam. That's how we have different phenotypes on their shells. But yeah, within these squirrels, they're not too obviously different, but there are going to be different sets of alleles within these different individuals, just like there are different sets of alleles among us. So we have variation. Why? Well, this variation comes from mutations. So we've talked about mutations before. We talked about this when we were talking about cancer and avoiding mutations and trying to prevent these things from happening. Usually mutations are bad. Again, mutations are just changing a gene sequence. Usually that's going to have a negative effect. But that's not always the case. A mutation is just a change in the gene sequence. And as much energy as we're spending to try to prevent these from happening, they are going to happen. And what they can do, instead of creating cancer cells, is mutations can create new alleles. They can take old versions of genes, change them up randomly, and make a new version of that gene, create a new allele. So to go back to these squirrels that all kind of looked pretty grayish and the same, there is a mutation that can create a darker fur color. So yeah, these are not different species. These are all still the Scurus carolinensis, the eastern gray squirrel. But yes, a mutation can create this, brown-black color, and, two copies of that mutation can create, black furred. This is a black eastern gray squirrel. If you're curious about genetics, this is an example of incomplete dominance where the heterozygote is intermediate in appearance between the two homozygotes. Don't worry about any of this callback. It's just, interesting if you find genetics interesting to call back to this. But yes, it is a mutation that creates these new phenotypes. And that's where all of our alleles come from. Mutations can create new alleles. Okay. Now, these variations are not always just a little more purple, a little more red, a little fewer dots, a little bigger dots, whatever. Sometimes these variations that exist within populations can actually affect whether those individuals are good or bad at surviving and reproducing. Got a bunch of key terms here, so I'll walk through this slowly. These variations that exist can affect evolutionary fitness. Let me read the key terms definition for evolutionary fitness. It is an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. So these differences that exist can affect the ability of that individual to survive and reproduce. I say can because, the purplishness and the reddishness on these clam shells, they're not significantly, they're not really affecting evolutionary fitness. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they can, and I'll show an example of that in just a second. When a variation does affect an individual's evolutionary fitness, the ability of them to survive and reproduce, we call that thing an adaptation. So let me read the key terms definition of adaptation. An adaptation is a heritable trait or behavior in an organism that aids in its survival and reproduction in its present environment. So it's some trait that helps them survive and reproduce. There's an important clause to that definition: in its present environment. So an adaptation is basically just good thing. It's an allele that is good for survival and reproduction. But whether it is good or not does depend on the present environment. So that brings us to the third key terms definition in this single slide. What is good and what is not good is defined by something called selective pressure. You read selective pressure. It is any factor that causes one allele or phenotype to be better than another. So this is very kind of vague. A selective pressure is any force, any factor, anything that is choosing what is good and bad, what is an adaptation and what is not an adaptation, what is going to help you survive and reproduce or not help you survive and reproduce. Let's look at an example of this, because this is a lot of vague terminology here. So this let's go back to these squirrels. So as it turns out, this melanistic variation, the brown or black, the darker fur allele on these eastern gray squirrels is actually an adaptation in parts of Canada. In the north part of North America, where it gets very cold in the winter. So having black fur, especially, to a lesser extent brown, but having this black fur helps you absorb more heat from sunlight and helps you survive when it's very, very cold outside. You're going to waste less energy keeping yourself warm, which is, it helps in survival of these squirrels during the long, cold winters. And so, yes, under these circumstances, parts of the world where the winters get very cold for a very long time, having this black allele, this black coat color allele, is an adaptation. It aids in survival and therefore reproduction. You survive the winter, therefore you can reproduce in the spring. This is an example of a variation, this mutation created new allele affecting evolutionary fitness. It is through an adaptation. This black coat color is an adaptation. It helps with survival and reproduction, and it's defined by the selective pressures. In this example, the selective pressure is the winter. It's the world around them. It's the environment. It's the cold. Again, selective pressure is any force that chooses what's good or not good. These harsh winters are saying this trait is good. It is going to be selected for. And importantly, we don't really see these kinds of squirrels in Louisiana. Our winters just don't get harsh enough for this to be selected for. So there's different selective pressures in different parts of the world. We may get a squirrel like this pop up on campus, rarely because a mutation creates it, but it's not really going to be selected for because it doesn't get very cold around here. So I'm not writing anything down on my slides about this particular squirrel example. We're going to see this a lot in this evolution chapter. I'm going to show you examples. What you really need to understand are these concepts, because on a test question, hint, hint, I'm going to pull up some other example and say, what's the selective pressure in this example? Is this an adaptation in this example? That kind of stuff. So these squirrels and this trait really just hammers home these three terms. What evolutionary fitness is, what is an adaptation, and what selective pressures are. Now, we've got more observations. Actually, just one more. Much of this variation that we saw in these populations is heritable. And this one's kind of a no-duh for us since we've already spent some time talking about genetics and heritability. These things are alleles. Alleles are passed on to offspring. So the variation that we see in any of these populations exists because of genes in chromosomes. They're going to be passed on to their offspring. That's pretty obvious. What we can do now is bring all of this together into a bigger inference. So we can infer that this struggle for survival, the limited resources, not everyone can make it, there's not enough, food and shelter and water to go around, that this struggle for survival is not completely random. It depends on certain traits or alleles that can be passed down to offspring. In other words, there are certain traits or alleles that can help you with survival and reproduction. Like this black allele if you've got really cold winters. And this can be passed down to offspring because they're genetically heritable. They're genes. They're on the chromosomes. So everything we've looked at so far, we can lump together into a concept called natural selection. So there's a lot of text here, but again, this is really just kind of summarizing everything we've walked through so far. Natural selection is a concept that states the few individuals that survive and reproduce, again, not everyone can make it, only some of them can, the few individuals that manage to survive and reproduce will be those that have traits or alleles that best help them survive and reproduce. Again, not completely random who lives and who dies. The ones that make it are going to be the ones with good traits, good alleles that are helping them survive and reproduce with those adaptations that aid in survival and reproduction. And, long statement here, their offspring will have these traits too because these traits are passed on to the offspring. So what this is going to mean is you could initially have just one brown squirrel because, there was a mutation that created this allele in this squirrel. You could have one of these, but because this darker fur coat aids in survival and reproduction in very cold climates, this squirrel is going to survive and reproduce a little bit better than anything else. It's going to have more offspring. Their offspring are going to inherit this allele. You're going to get more brown squirrels. They're going to survive and reproduce better. Their offspring are going to inherit this allele. And hey, maybe some of them are going to end up homozygous for this allele. You're going to have black-furred squirrels. These are going to survive and reproduce better than the common gray phenotype. And so eventually, over generation and generation and generation, this good allele, this adaptation, is going to become more and more and more common within these squirrel populations. So because of natural selection, over a few generations, natural selection is going to lead to an increase in the allele frequency in that population of any favorable alleles. Any good alleles, any adaptations that help with survival and reproduction, they're going to become more common in the population over generations. And again, individuals are not changing their alleles, but if you look at the overall population, that makeup is going to change. And yeah, this is the very definition of evolution: change in the genetic makeup, changing in the allele frequency within this population over time. That's exactly what we defined as evolution at the end of the last recorded lecture. Specifically, this is an example of something called adaptive evolution, which, again, a lot of key terms in this chapter, not a lot of text to write down, but a lot of key terms. Adaptive evolution is defined as, over time, an increase in the frequency of beneficial alleles and a decrease in deleterious or bad alleles in a population due to natural selection. So adaptive evolution just means good stuff becomes more common, bad stuff becomes less common. And yes, natural selection leads to adaptive evolution. That's the relationship between these two terms. This is natural selection, and this is what it causes. Let's look at another example. Again, the squirrels are cool, but let's run this back again. So let's go back to elephants, African elephants. So specifically, let's look at their tusks. So yeah, these are a very conspicuous part of their form. Very cool. They use them to dig through the soil to find tubers, to find food sources. It's not their main way of getting food, but it helps them get food. It helps them fend off predators who might be trying to get at their young. Makes them pretty scary to contend with. And males, at least during mating season, they'll use this to fight each other to try to get the females. But yeah, these tusks are used in a lot of different ways to do a lot of different things. They are a very good trait. However, under the present circumstances, the biggest threat to the survival of African elephants is not lions. It's not starvation due to not getting enough tubers. It's not securing mates by fighting with other males. Right now, the biggest threat to the survival of African elephants is poaching. Elephants are being poached specifically to get this their tusks for crime scene do not enter, the very illegal for the illegal trade of ivory. So these are our circumstances. These are our selective pressures. This is what we're operating with. A handful of years ago, a mutation in a population of African elephants created tuskless elephants. Again, the tusk is a modified tooth. A mutation popped up this is a population in Mozambique, I believe. This mutation led to them not developing tusks. They're just missing those teeth. And, under any other circumstances, this would be horrible. This would be bad for them. However, like I said, the biggest selective pressure is poaching. These tuskless elephants, because of us, this is actually an adaptation. Poachers are not going to go after these elephants. It's a waste of time. They don't have any ivory. Being tuskless helps these elephants survive and reproduce. It is an adaptation under these circumstances. And here's a figure from an evolutionary biology paper analyzing this is a little bit even beyond my pay grade as a protein biochemist, but I wanted to bring this up to show that it's not just people saying, oh yeah, there's some tuskless elephants. These are being very closely monitored, very closely graphed. The numbers are being analyzed. What we're seeing in this population of elephants in Mozambique, very slowly, because again, elephant generation time is pretty long, we're seeing an increase in this allele within the population. So, go back to this. what we're seeing is an adaptation. That's the tusklessness. It is an adaptation because of the selective pressures. Under these circumstances, poaching is a very strong selective pressure, choosing who lives and who dies. That makes the tusklessness, not having these tusks, that makes that trait an adaptation. It is selected for, it helps with their evolutionary fitness, and what we're seeing is adaptive evolution. Over generations, the tusklessness allele is becoming more common in the population because it's a favorable allele under these selective pressures. We're seeing adaptive evolution in this population of elephants. And hey, it could happen in other populations of elephants as well. You just got to wait for the right mutation to come along. So this is kind of a misconception in evolution in general, that evolution pushes things to be the best as possible, the best versions, the best at survival and reproduction. And I mean, that is true. Adaptive evolution is leading to an increase in good stuff, good alleles, but evolution only works with what you have. We need mutations creating new alleles. We're relying on this sort of randomness of mutations, and then, selective pressure, adaptation, natural selection, all these things, they're working with what they've got. So when there is a mutation, if it's good, it's selected for, it's going to become more common, but there's no guarantee that such a mutation will arise. There are going to be other populations of African elephants that, all have their tusks and are going to be poached and, are going to suffer from this. But yeah, under these circumstances, it's an adaptation and it's being selected for. These alleles are becoming more common in this population. This population of elephants is evolving. One more example. So here's a slide from the first day of class, if you remember that first lecture. And I pointed out over here that adaptation through the process of evolution, was something that all living things deal with. So it's not just, big, interesting mammals like squirrels or African elephants. This is something that all living things do. So for my third example here, I want to bring up bacteria. It's easy to forget these microscopic single-celled organisms, but bacteria are subject to everything that we've talked about so far as well. So in this example, we are looking at the effects of something called penicillin. So penicillin is an antibiotic. What it does is it binds to enzymes that bacteria have that are responsible for building their cell wall. It shuts down those enzymes. The bacteria cannot build their cell wall. They're going to be dead. So penicillin, it's really bad for these bacteria. Really great for us if you've got an infection or something like that, because it will prevent these bacteria from growing. They'll be dead. So mutation can come along. A mutation can come along that creates an enzyme in these bacteria called beta-lactamase. You don't need to know the name of it, but here it is, fun enzyme, whatever. This is created by a mutation. What this enzyme does is it breaks apart this ring in penicillin. So if penicillin is broken apart right here, it is no longer able to do its thing. It's no longer able to disrupt these enzymes. It's not going to interfere with cell wall synthesis. These bacteria are not going to be killed. They're going to be just fine. They don't care about penicillin at all. So mutation, just to go through all of this again, a mutation creates a new allele, a gene that encodes this protein, this enzyme. Under these circumstances, when penicillin is around, this is an adaptation. It helps with survival and reproduction. Any bacteria that have the gene for this enzyme, when penicillin is around, they're going to survive and reproduce a lot better than any bacteria that don't have that gene. And so, across bacterial generations, and bacteria tend to reproduce pretty quickly, especially compared to elephants and squirrels, over a few generations, bacteria with this gene that allows them to resist penicillin, they're going to become more and more and more common until eventually you have an entire population of bacteria that don't care about this drug at all. So just to run back these key terms, the selective pressure, the thing that was choosing what is good and what is not, in this example was penicillin, choosing whether beta-lactamase is good or not. The adaptation was this enzyme that breaks down penicillin, the beta-lactamase. And what we see in hospitals, unfortunately, very often, is the evolution of drug-resistant bacteria. And penicillin is just one example, but the same sort of thing is happening with lots of different classes of antibiotics. It's becoming kind of a big thing in the medical field, multi-drug resistant bacteria that have evolved resistance to lots of different drugs that we can throw at them. Used to be able to treat a lot of infections just by, hey, have some antibiotics, everything's fine. It's becoming more difficult because of evolution. Again, all living things are subject to the process of evolution, not just animals. It's fungi, it's plants, it's bacteria. All living things are going to do this. Okay, so all of this so far was about natural selection and adaptive evolution. And that is a key part in evolution and the theory of evolution. But now I want to talk about some factors other than natural selection that cause changes in the genetic makeup of a population over time. So natural selection, very important in evolution. It's not the only thing. So I'm double underlining this because there are going to be several things underneath this heading. There are going to be several other factors other than natural selection that result in these kinds of changes. The first of these factors is something called genetic drift. So this is in the key terms, another one. Let me read the key terms definition for genetic drift. The effects of chance on a population's gene pool. So to go back to natural selection, yes, sometimes having a specific enzyme or having a specific trait or gene or whatever is going to help you survive and reproduce. But sometimes whether you survive or reproduce is totally up to chance. And so here's an example of this, looking at rabbits. So stick with me here. In this particular example, it looks like we've got a brown allele and a white allele. And for this to work, these alleles do not affect survival and reproduction. The white allele is not better than the brown allele. The brown allele is not better than the white allele. They blend in different ways. They have their strengths and weaknesses. But yeah, coat color does not affect survival and reproduction for this example. We're going to start off with a 50-50 split of brown allele and white allele. If you're counting brown rabbits and counting white rabbits, this doesn't look like 50-50. Well, if you count the alleles of capital B, lowercase b, it's a 50-50 split just in this hypothetical. So let's say we've got, these 10 rabbits, and after 1 year, these 5 rabbits survive, these 5 rabbits don't. Was it because brown is better than white? No. It's just these 5, they, got eaten by a hawk, or a snake, or a fox, or, man, there are a lot of things that like to eat rabbits, but all these rabbits, starve to death or, succumb to disease or predators or whatever due to random chance. These 5 survived. And it just so happens that these 5 surviving rabbits had a lot of the brown allele. Again, it wasn't because brown was better, they just happened to have more of that allele. So when these 5 rabbits reproduce, a lot of their offspring are going to have that brown allele. Let's run through another generation. Let's say this is a really rough year. There's not a lot of food available. A lot of these rabbits are going to starve to death when things start to get scarce. After this generation, only 2 rabbits are going to manage to survive and reproduce. Everything else is going to be dead. Why these 2? Randomness. in the right place at the right time to not get eaten by a predator, or maybe they happen to find a patch of grass or some tuber or something like that that these other rabbits didn't find, or random that these two made it and the other ones didn't. But look at these two survivors. They've got all brown allele. So once they have their offspring, by this third generation, it's all brown. The white allele is completely gone. And again, it was not because the brown allele was better. In this example, the brown allele is not an adaptation. The white allele is not a bad thing. It's just the random selection of who lives and who dies and who reproduces and who doesn't that led to it being all brown and no white. If you ran this again, it could easily go in the opposite direction. And in fact, here's a crazy looking graph that just shows how erratic this can be. If we had 20 rabbits or whatever, you run this simulation. Sometimes they're all brown. Sometimes they're all white. You get wild swings back and forth just due to the randomness of things living and dying. Importantly, this looks so erratic when population levels are low. When you look at a larger population, there's still going to be some effect of chance on the frequency of these alleles, but it's not as pronounced. And when we look at very large populations, we almost don't notice this at all. So this is something that it doesn't play a huge role in the overall evolution of populations, especially when we're looking at really big populations. But in smaller things, we will see the effects of this in a pretty big way. So again, this is defined in the key terms, effects of chance. I want to add to that by saying the effects are stronger in smaller populations. We tend to not see the effects hardly at all in very large populations, but we see it a lot in smaller ones. Okay, let's look at another factor other than natural selection that results in evolution. Let's look at something called the bottleneck effect. So this is not in the key terms. I've written out the definition here. This is when a natural disaster or catastrophic event, something, dramatically, randomly is important, reduces population size, which is a very polite way of saying kills almost everyone. So this is called the bottleneck effect because this is like if you had a bottle full of individuals in the population. You could treat each one of these beads here as an individual, or the alleles within the population, and you dump out a few of them and then you throw away the bottle. The rest of them are dead. The ones that survived, again, were not because they had some allele or trait that helped them survive. These survivors survived because of randomness. Whatever this disaster is, this wildfire, this hurricane, this earthquake, this volcanic eruption, whatever this is, it's randomly killing almost everything. The survivors are chosen randomly. So what does this do? Well, here's my crudely drawn bottle here with an original population of, you get some of these purple alleles, some of these green alleles, some of these gray alleles, and yeah, let's say we have some sort of catastrophe, and the survivors are this. These are just the ones that happen to be in the right place at the right time to survive this catastrophe. Well, if we let these survivors rebound and reproduce after a time of recovery, population's going to look like this. Wow. Okay, this is very different from the original population. This purple allele used to be pretty rare, but now it's the most common allele. That's because the survivors happen to have a lot of that allele. Not because this purple allele is good or an adaptation. These randomly selected survivors had a lot of this rare allele, and now it's become very common in the population. But that's not the only way that this can work out. Again, it's random. A lot of different things can happen. Or, starting population, maybe these are the survivors. And after a few generations of recovery, we end up with a population like this. None of the survivors had this purple allele in this scenario. Again, it was pretty rare. It's not that weird that none of the survivors would have that allele. So now this rare allele has been lost completely. A few generations later, it's completely gone from the population because none of the survivors had it. Or, here's our starting population, catastrophe, recovery, looks pretty much the same. So sometimes this has no effect at all on things. You know, the purple was still present, but it was kind of rare. You had some green, you had some gray, you had some recovery. Looks more or less like it did in the beginning. Any of these things can happen. Here's how I summarize this. Natural disaster dramatically randomly reduces population size, like I said before. Because of the bottleneck effect, rare alleles may become more common, or they may become less common, or they may be lost completely. Any of these things are possibilities because, again, we're randomly choosing who lives and who dies. There's an interesting example of the bottleneck effect. It's not something we can easily see, you know, with color-coded alleles here, but it does have to do with the cheetah population. So cheetahs have experienced a fairly recent, very severe bottleneck effect. For them, the catastrophic event was not, you know, a wildfire or a volcano. For them, the catastrophic event was us hunting them nearly to extinction. And what we've eliminated is almost all of the rare alleles. And again, you can't really see this by looking at them, but we've eliminated almost all of the genetic diversity in cheetahs on the entire planet. All the rare alleles have been lost. It's nothing but common alleles. If you take any random cheetah and some other random cheetah in a completely different part of the world, you know, completely different parents, if you compare them to one another, they are as genetically similar as siblings. So this has, again, it's not something you can easily see looking at colors and stuff, but the bottleneck effect has reduced the genetic diversity among cheetahs to the point where it's nothing but common alleles. Every single cheetah on the planet is as closely related to every other cheetah on the planet as you would be to your sibling. Very low genetic diversity because of this bottleneck effect. Let's look at another one. Again, we're still under factors other than natural selection that do result in changes in the genetic makeup of populations over time. The founder effect. So the founder effect is when a small group of randomly selected individuals go to a new place and start a new population in a new region. They found a new population, hence founder effect. So we could take a original population of individuals and randomly select some individuals from this to move to a new region. These are our randomly selected founders. They're going to reproduce, they're going to repopulate this new region, and the genetic alleles, the alleles present in this new region are going to reflect those of the founders. So, looks like there's a lot of this purple allele. It used to be pretty rare in the original population. Why is it so common in this new population? Well, it's because the founders had a lot of this allele. But again, this is due to random selection of founders. That's not the only way it can be. Or we could have, original population. These are our randomly selected founders, and after a few generations, here's what it looks like. That rare allele has been lost completely. Or, maybe you're seeing what I can do. I just lazily took my bottle and relabeled it here with a square. Original population, founders, new population, pretty much the same thing. So I'm going to write the exact same thing that I wrote for the bottleneck effect, that when you have the founder effect, rare alleles, like this, the purple allele here in this example, they may become more common, or they may become less common, or they may be lost completely, or nothing may happen at all. So again, all the same possibilities that we saw with the bottleneck effect can also happen with the founder effect. Lots of ors here because, these founders, they're selected randomly. It could be, these, it could be these, it could be these randomly selected founders, just like there were randomly selected survivors. There are lots of examples of this in nature of, a group of beetles or small lizards or something, clinging to a tree trunk after a hurricane, and that tree trunk gets swept to a new island, and they start a new population on that island. But there's also a very interesting example of the founder effect in humans, actually. So this involves a small group of humans from the United Kingdom moving down to one of the most remote places on the entire planet, this tiny little island called Tristan da Cunha. And so this was in 1814. A small group of British colonists coming down here, and as it turned out, and again, randomly selected, not like, chosen by, okay, it's going to be you, I'm going to select you, we want to make sure your genes are good. No, randomly selected people got on a boat, moved down here. It turns out that among those founders, there was a high proportion of an allele that leads to something called retinitis pigmentosa. This is a progressive form of blindness that afflicts homozygous individuals. Again, because it's not present in heterozygous individuals, they didn't notice this on everyone coming down here. But just due to randomness, this rare allele was much more common among the founders. So flash forward 200 years, now if we analyze, because they haven't moved around too much, if we analyze the population on this remote island, there is a lot more of this allele on the occupants of this island than there is anywhere else in the world. I have some numbers that you do not have to memorize. A lot of inbreeding here on this island with this small group of founders. Worldwide, the prevalence of retinitis pigmentosa allele is 1 in 4,000. Pretty rare. On the island, it's 1 in 58. So, almost 100 times more common on this island because the founders just happen to have a lot of this very rare allele. Again, just an example of how things could have gone here. Another factor other than natural selection that can result in evolution, something called gene flow. So let me read the key terms definition for gene flow. Gene flow is the flow of alleles in and out of a population due to the individual or gamete migration. Gametes are eggs and sperm. You think about a tree just sort of throwing out its sperm present on pollen to new areas. This is when individuals or their eggs and sperm just flow, just migrate to another location. If we want a visual on this, here's a population of beetles. They're all green. Here's a population of beetles. They're all brown. Due to some epic voyage, this brown beetle makes it to the green population. Now its brown alleles are part of this population. Whether brown is better than green, that's another story. Whether this population is going to change over time, that's another story. But gene flow is introducing novel alleles to this population because this individual migrated from this population to this population. So gene flow, again, I'm avoiding using the word new, because these are not brand new alleles. They already existed, but this green beetle population had never seen the brown allele before, so it's novel to them. Gene flow can introduce novel alleles to a population. If we want to talk about actual new, we can bring up another factor other than natural selection that can result in evolution, mutations, which I've already mentioned. Mutations can create new versions of things. Mutations are the only thing that can really create absolutely brand new versions of genes, brand new alleles. That definitely affects the genetic makeup of a population. Okay, last one, and this is kind of an interesting one. It is something called non-random mating. So non-random mating kind kind of implies the existence of random mating, which is very weird for us to think about as, humans and mammals, really. But random mating is very common when you look outside of vertebrates. You think about, again, to reference trees again, trees just sending out their pollen, it's going to pollinate whatever it happens to stick to. That's random mating. If you want to look at sponges in the ocean, just releasing their sperm into the water column, trying to find another sponge, that's random mating. So yeah, it's pretty common in the world, even though it's not common for us. Non-random mating, though, also known as sexual selection, is when there is a choice involved. So this whole time, all our examples have been alleles that aid in survival. So to zip back to some of our other examples of natural selection, this was an allele that helped with survival, surviving the effects of penicillin. This allele helped with survival. They didn't get poached because they weren't attractive targets for that. This helped with survival, bottling in heat, absorbing more heat, surviving those cold winters. But remember, evolution is about survival and reproduction. If an allele helps you reproduce, if an allele helps an organism secure a mate, it's going to be selected for. Something is good and selected for and is going to become more common in a population if it helps with reproduction. So if you have individuals, if you have non-random mating, if you have selection here, anything that is going to make a mate choose you, that's going to be selected for. We see lots of examples of this in birds, actually. So this leads to a lot of what's called sexual dimorphism, and I'll come back to that definition in a second. Let's look at these birds. So you've got female mandarin ducks choosing which males to mate with. They are going to choose the brightest, flashiest mandarin ducks because it's an indication of how healthy they are. They don't have parasites and they're not diseased. They're going to have, bright, vibrant colors. The female is choosing the flashiest males, so these bright, vibrant colors are going to be selected for. Female cardinals are choosing the brightest, reddest males. Having red feathers is going to be selected for. The very drab-looking peahen is choosing the peacock with, the biggest, brightest, flashiest colors. It's an indicator of health. So all of these things that don't have anything to do with survival. In fact, sometimes they can actually harm your ability to survive as you sort of stick out and are easier for predators to find. But these traits are aiding in reproduction. They're helping these birds secure a mate. The females are making this selection. Again, they don't have to be flashy. The males aren't making any choices here at all. The females are choosing a partner. So there's no selective pressure. There's no selection for them having bright, flashy colors. But yes, bright, flashy colors on the males are going to be selected for. They help with reproduction. And this leads to, like I said, sexual dimorphism, which is defined in the key terms as phenotypic difference between a population's males and females. So yeah, males and females here in these examples, all very different from one another. There's a high degree of sexual dimorphism because there's a very strong sexual selection within these species. So yeah, just to point out, it's not all about reproduction, it's not all about survival, it's also about reproduction. Anything that helps you with either of those things is going to be selected for. Okay, we can finally put everything we've looked at in this recorded lecture together to define the theory of evolution. It's not as long as it sounds. The theory of evolution can be defined as evolution occurs. In other words, we have changes in the genetic makeup of populations that happen over time, driven by natural selection, genetic drift, and I'm not naming all of them, all those other forces that we talked about, non-random mating, gene flow, stuff like that. So yeah, this is our definition. And again, it's a short one because we spent so much time talking about all these little parts to this. Evolution happens because of natural selection, genetic drift, and all these other forces. So this is a theory because this is very broad in scope. Again, it's talking about the how of changes, how these changes happen because, certain individuals survive and reproduce more than others. This is explaining the why of why these changes occur. Because certain individuals survive more than others because of selective pressures, all of this stuff. This is explaining the how and why of evolution, and there's a lot of support for it. All these things we've talked about, there are many examples of looking at the effects of non-random mating or the founder effect or gene flow or natural selection. There's a ton of supporting evidence for these forces causing changes in the allele frequency in populations over time. So it's a broad explanation. There's a lot of support for this explanation. That's why it's a theory. Evolution happens, driven by natural selection, genetic drift, and all these other forces. Oh, okay. This is kind of a long lecture, but very important to hammer home this. We are not done with these two chapters on evolution, but this is a very good break point here to end this particular recorded lecture. We will pick up with the last part of this chapter in the next one, but this is the end of recorded lecture 4.4.